And then, as I point out in the book, Nick Cook does as well, I basically copy from him, you can see for yourself, you can go look at the documents, that there is open discussion in magazine articles, aerospace interest magazines, to the mid-1950s that they're developing anti-gravity engines.
It's quite open, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's quite open, not dismissive. There's one particularly one that I found of interest, which I don't think was mentioned in Nick Cook's book, and it's by somebody from White Sands missile range, some captain or something, and he talks about there being anti-gravity drives. And White Sands, again, is not too far from Roswell. And that article, I think, was written in 56 or 57, and I found a couple of more examples to add to the ones that Nick Cook wrote about in his book. And some kind people have posted a lot of these articles on Scribd, or Scribd, whatever they call it, so you can download the original article and read them for yourself. And I quote bits of them in the book and give you the links to find them. And then I'm thinking, as I probably said in the last interview about Apollo, where are we at? We're mid-50s, 1956, 1957. What happened in 1957? So I probably said last time, it was Sputnik. It was the launch of Sputnik. That was the start of the chemical rockets-based public space program, which is really all that they've ever discussed with any depth in the wide world and the mainstream media. So we had all that hoo-ha with Russia launching the Sputnik and saying, oh, if they can launch Sputnik, they can drop a bomb on us from space, blah blah blah. And that allegedly then kicked off the US space program, kick-started that, and there was the race, and then we had Explorer 1 and da-de-da.
So was it then that these experiments with anti-gravity that were shelved?
Yeah, I mean that's basically linked, that's right. So it appears to me, and Nick Cook writes the same, that it went black. The discussion that they said, right, okay, folks, we've got the public space program now. We can keep all the space talk. Guys, just talk about that. That's interesting enough in itself. You just talk about that. Don't talk about this other stuff. We can just get on and do that. We don't need to tell anybody. So that's my impression that what went on, which Nick Cook implies, and probably Paula Violette implies as well. So again, I'm not really saying anything different to what other people say. I'm just maybe adding on about the public space program coming up in profile in media, in public's mind, from around the same time. I don't think there's other people have said that perhaps in the same way as I have. And then we had the whole thing, with Gagarin going up allegedly in 61. And I mentioned in the book the story about Lord Bruce Gardine, Jock Gardine, who was in the Soviet Union, or Russia as it was then, USSR, whatever you want to call it. And he heard that the Gagarin had launched. And then he was travelling back to the UK, and I think he was in Berlin the next day, having travelled by train or something, and he heard the public address announcement in Berlin saying that Gagarin had just launched and just gone into space, even though he'd heard the same story a day previously in the Soviet Union. In other words, he heard the same live broadcast about the same event on 2 days, separate days. And this was what David Percy wrote about, and it's in his what happened on the moon documentary. He goes into a bit more detail about that, and I quote him and the story which was in one of the British newspapers where Jock Bruce Gardine expresses skepticism that Gagarin did what was claimed.
Which then kind of addresses that Russia would have,
Russia would have blown the whistle.
Okay.
Yes, that's why I mentioned it. I may have mentioned that in the Apollo interview we did, perhaps, but nevertheless, it's appropriate to mention it again here. So, I mentioned that, and pointing out that this is a coordinated effort to have an interesting public space program with rivalry, and successes, and mainly successes and not many failures. The Soviets clearly hid their failures, and that's pretty well documented by others. They had a lot more hidden failures that we've now found out about. We don't know if the Americans had hidden failures because we may not have found out about them, but they appeared to be at least more open with the public space program than the Russians were. That appears to be still, a valid opinion in my view. So the whole Gagarin thing, that was just another stunt, really. Then, really, I obviously discussed Apollo, which we discussed at length in the other interviews, and I discussed some of the problems with the evidence there, and talk about things like, well, maybe they had to send a remote capsule to the moon because it appears that people did pick up radio signals from the moon, or coming from the direction of them, because apparently some of the amateur radio people did pick up signals from there. But that doesn't necessarily prove that it was Neil Armstrong and his buddies in the capsule. They'd allegedly already remotely landed lunar rovers by '69 then. Obviously they would have done that in preparation for the manned missions. It would have been daft not to. Russians claim to have done it. The Americans claim to have done it. So they could have landed a transmitter on the moon, beamed signals to that, and back again. And as is pointed out in Bill Kaysing's book, they had this whole Apollo simulation project, which he became aware of. The ASP, I think it was called. That was a sort of semi-secret program, which was allegedly so that the real one didn't fail. But what if it was a bit more than the real one not failing? What if it was set up so that they were faking elements of the real program? That's basically the argument that Kaysing was making, and I repeat that here, really, essentially. So I talk about that and problems with the cameras, notwithstanding the heat and stuff. And the weirdness of what the astronauts have said.
There's a lot of anomalies out
there is when you stack them up. When you stack them up. There are too many, really. I discussed a little bit about the radiation and the fact that also one of the things that I'd heard but I needed just to check about was this business with the heat shield. I'd read some report a few years ago that NASA said they'd lost the formula for the heat shield material that they used on the re-entry craft from the Apollo mission. And so when it came to this new Orion mission, they had to design it completely from scratch. That was what I'd read, and I thought, oh, come on, that can't be true. But it turned out that seemed to be sort of partly true, because what I'd picked up was a report from the Smithsonian Institution website, which said that they gave one of the surviving Apollo heat shields to the Orion crew for their research. So something weird going on there. If NASA need to be given something back from a museum for a new space program, that was in 2008. So what's going on there? The other thing that I found, which we didn't talk about last time because I didn't know it then, but I did mention part of this briefly, was that Richard Hoagland claims that the astronauts underwent some form of mind control to make them believe that they did certain things on the moon and saw certain things on the moon and didn't see other things, such as the alien artifacts that he claims. And he goes on about there being these remnants of huge glass domes, and the astronauts would have obviously seen these, according to Hoagland, when they were jumping around on the surface. So they needed to be mind controlled so that they didn't tell people they saw these glass dome remnants. Now, despite the fact that you can't see any of these remnants, which are meant to be like half a mile or a mile high, according to Hoagland, big structures, there's nothing on any of the photographs. You can't see any evidence from Earth-based telescopes, which now are pretty good. So, from my estimation, if they were as big and as salient as Hoagland were claiming, you would be able to see them from Earth-based telescopes, and probably good amateur telescopes would see some evidence of them. But I don't know of any picture of that. So to me, that is Hoagland putting out disinformation. But what I then found from that, in researching this astronaut mind control story, which Hoagland claims that he was told by an MD that worked for NASA that all astronauts were hypnotised. And I found a little bit of corroboration for that, because there's this story that NASA got concerned because some of the astronauts were effing and blinding while they were, jumping across the moon, just absent-mindedly waiting to do things, or passing the time of day between between one experimental station and the other, and they were accidentally swearing. Right. So the story, which is on this website, which apparently was written up on the Smithsonian Institution, was that they decided they would get one of the astronauts to undergo hypnotherapy to clean up his language, to stop him from swearing. Mm-hmm. And you can read this story. Mm-hmm. It's on a blog, and it's on the Smithsonian Institution website references. And this astronaut was allegedly Pete Conrad. Mm-hmm. Now, looking at these things as I do now, to me that is kind of like a cover story. Yeah. And I think it does support the claim that the astronauts did undergo some type of mental manipulation or mind control. And of course, you could argue that there may be a perfectly legitimate reason for doing that. Mm. If, for example, looking at it from a non-conspiratorial or from a more trusting point of view, if you could hypnotise an astronaut and make him better at what he did, so that he didn't, he could remember sequences of button presses or sequences of actions better. If you could hypnotise them, they did a better job of that. You're going to do it, aren't you, for your mission? Just looking at it purely from a practical and you're going to do that. But that also opens up the possibility that you could do it. You could implant other information there, like, for example, these ideas that you actually walked on the moon when you didn't. And this is what I see, certainly in the case of Edgar Mitchell, and I also reference a bit more material from Bill Kaysing's book about Buzz Aldrin, where he was asked the same question. He was asked the exact same question, I think, in 1975, was it? It might be before then, but I've got the date in the book, about what it felt like to walk on the moon. What did it feel like to walk on the moon? And I got Buzz Aldrin's first book, which was Return to Earth, published I think in 75. I think it was 75. Got it for like £3 on Amazon or something. I had to get that book because Bill Kaysing had put this quote in it to his book from that 1975 book, but he didn't give a page number, so I had to find the page number. And I trusted Kaysing as a source, because I think he's totally honest about everything he said. And sure enough, he was right. But Aldrin relates this story where he was asked this question. He broke out in a cold sweat, found it very, very difficult to answer the question, and it went outside and was sick. And Aldrin relates that in his own book. And it's just very, very similar to Edgar Mitchell's reaction, where he said he couldn't remember what it felt like to walk on the moon. And later on, he had to be hypnotised to try and retrieve this information. He actually says that in this conversation with Richard Hoagland. So that, to me, and there's maybe one or two other little things I mentioned, does suggest that there was some type of mind manipulation going on with the astronauts.
Just correlate with it.
And you look at the behaviour, look at the press conference and stuff, and I think the way that they did that did get better after Apollo 11. As Bart Bell's film says, all the missions were faked. They just got better at faking it later on. And I think they got more confident about the faking later on as well. And I think they made more mistakes in the later missions as well, as I make that argument in my chapters on Apollo. And I point out some of these errors with the orange juice, where you got this orange juice spilt on the lens of the cameras. That came from Jet Wintzer's film, which is a very powerful bit of evidence to my way of looking at it, which proved that must have been filmed in a studio.
The film couldn't be developed on the moon. It had a chain of custody. That had to take place, and those guys were not in on it. So what has just happened to cause this stain pattern to emerge? The answer is orange juice. It has been well documented that the astronauts had a problem with the suction straws inside their helmets that allowed them to take sips of orange juice. The straws would accidentally squirt orange juice all over them and into their helmets, and this was a big problem on the mission, and the orange juice actually seeped into the neck ring, and it appears obvious now that the orange juice leaked through the neck ring at Station 9 and caused the camera to be stained. And that is direct evidence that they could not possibly be on the moon, because if orange juice could leak through the helmet lock, then the helmet lock was not properly sealed to protect the astronauts from the vacuum of space. And this is because the helmet and the neck ring, in order to be airtight, must also have been watertight, because water molecules are bigger than air molecules. So if water escaped, then oxygen also escaped, and the suit would not have been pressurized, and in that case, the astronauts would be dead.
Yeah. No possible way, you know, where they spilt this orange juice and it appears on all the subsequent frames in the film. You're thinking, oh my, this is just crazy, you know.
But I mean, because of this damning, the damning evidence of it is never even mentioned much on alternative media. Like
the what sort of it?
Things like the orange juice spillage. It's not even. Not many people even people you know who agree with. They didn't land on the moon. Still don't know that. They don't know all the photographs or Charlie.
That's right, Charlie Duke thing. That's one of the most compelling to me. I think we discussed in the last video.
And
But to explain the orange juice one, because we sort of just jumped right into that. I can't remember if we covered that in the last interview, but I will mention it here briefly. It's easy to explain. If you look at this Jet Winster analysis, he shows that the orange juice must have leaked out from around the neck linkage of the helmet. If you look at the sequence of events, look at the sequence of pictures, look at the Apollo Lunar Surface Journal, look at what's reported, look at the video, because you've got the photo, you've got the video, you've got the transcript, you've got all those three things, you've got NASA's official story of what happened, and they don't match up. You can clearly go back and look at them, and I went back and looked, and they do not match. So the only conclusion that you can come is that orange juice leaked out of the suit. Therefore, that means that the suit wasn't watertight, which means it wasn't airtight, which means if they were on the moon, they'd be dead. It's as simple as that. You know, once you look at it. Again, it takes a bit of a while to go through those three sets of evidence, but it's there. As is the Alan Bean hammer, which is also, I don't know, I can't remember mentioned that in the book, but that's in Jet Winster's film. Alan Bean is videoed bashing this stake into the moon for an experiment, and you can hear the sound on the Apollo soundtrack.
Really?
Okay. And yet, on NASA's own science webpage, which has now been changed and deleted, they show this very picture of Alan Bean banging this stake into the rock, saying, on the moon there would be no sound because it's a vacuum. Even though on their own video, you can hear them bashing.
Good. Go for a little more. Yeah. Got a half a tube. Ooh, good. Nice. You got 3/4? Yeah, it feels like it's hung up on a rock. Okay, I got the picture. Go ahead and hammer. Back. Oh, it's going in. You're getting it. There's a full core. And then you're getting a couple inches of stroke. Very nice.
You know, it's that extreme.
But so taking it off on the second one, just but on the original.
On the still image that they've got on the moon showing this, him doing this, they said there is no sound on the moon, and this was meant to be an educational page for children. It's in the Jet Winster video if people want to watch it. It's pretty crazy. But there's a few more bits and bobs which I explain in that book. And again, books are available from checktheevidence.com. Free download as PDF. All my books are free PDF downloads. You can get an ebook version for like £4 or something, or a paperback for £10-11. Anybody wants to sort of read it. Anybody that wants to read it, if they can put a review on Amazon, you know, make it an honest review. If you didn't like it, say you didn't like it. But obviously, I'm looking for positive reviews, really. You know, I want everyone to be honest. That's what I try to be honest. So anybody that can do that's doing me a favour if they can post a review, and as you know you did on it, John, which we're very grateful for the other book. So moving on from there, Apollo, it was a hoax. You know, it's been done to death.
All the evidence available, there's no more conclusion, is there?
Not really, not to my way of thinking. No.
No.
So I cover that.
Yeah.
Then I start to go into some of the other more sort of speculative areas, and I start looking at things like Colonel Corso, who isn't necessarily directly associated with the secret space program as such, but I wanted to see, for my own interest, if there was any kind of connection from what he claimed, which is that he claimed that he was part of a group that was responsible for material recovered during the Roswell crash, where this disc crashed in 1947 at Corona in New Mexico, and pieces were retrieved and then over subsequent years were reverse engineered and so forth, and at least one of the aliens survived, according to this story. And I'd read his book previously called The Day After Roswell, which was released in 1997, co-written by Bill Burns, although he did most of the writing, it would appear. I mean, that's like 20 years ago, isn't that? 1997.
Yeah.
20 years since that. So I called my chapter on Corso years after The Day After Roswell, it's like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so what I found was, in looking, I wanted to look for more on that, was that Corso's son, Philip J. Corso Jr., he had apparently watched Corso go through the Day After Roswell book, and Corso apparently wasn't very happy with the book because a lot of it had been kind of changed from what Corso had actually told Burns, or changed perhaps a bit too much in some areas. So I wanted to get a little bit more and see what the basis of that was. Unfortunately for me and everyone else, Philip J. Corso, or somebody, has released a set of Corso's original notes, or what the remains of them, typed up in a PDF file. And it's called The Dawn of the New Age. So I go through that. It's about 170 pages, I think. And I go through the most interesting parts of that write-up and do a sort of critique of it. And that's in that chapter. There's quite a lot of detail there. Don't go through everything, and I'm not trying to either support or debunk the Roswell incident particularly. I was just more interested if there was anything that Corso said which might give me a bit more info or direction on what to look for in a secret space program type of area, And the simple answer is there wasn't an enormous amount, although there were a couple of interesting bits and bobs. I mean, this idea of the materials, I do think from reading his notes, he did know something about the materials which were recovered. And possibly he had some kind of tangential responsibility for certain projects which were connected to these materials, or had people working in those projects that knew about those materials, but more than Corso did. I think he might have been a bit of a gopher, really, of some kind. But if you read his notes, they're not particularly well written, and they're quite repetitive. There's some pages where he basically repeats the same story. So as a writer, I can see that Bill Burns, he would have needed to tidy these things up, embellish them, smooth out the wording, because there are, the bits which are not very well written, they're not very engaging. But Corso does have some very interesting tales as well, like he encountered a UFO in the desert and it materialised and he spoke to a being and this sort of thing, which I don't remember being in the Day After Roswell book, but that's quite an interesting account. And then he talks about, I think, where it does sort of slightly feed into the secret space program a bit, he talks about there being a war with aliens of one kind or another. And I know he does mention that in the Day After Roswell. He said that there were certain conflicts and they developed certain technologies to basically fight the aliens. And he says that both in his own notes, and it is mentioned a little bit in the Day After Roswell. And I don't quite know what to make of that. Some of it seems sort of, when you've looked at everything else, you can sort of say, yeah. And my impression was that Corso did know stuff, and I think he did have access to certain information, but I don't think he was, he wasn't head of a black program, for example. I think he knew there were black programs were going on. I think maybe the general that he worked with, General Trudeau, who he speaks very highly of, probably knew a lot more, and maybe he told Corso certain things about some of the black programs, but I don't really think Corso worked directly on them. And this idea that he was the sole person responsible for taking these materials and giving them to industry, I don't really believe that part of the story. I believe that he might have known that process was going on, and he maybe had some kind of tangential responsibility for parts of that process, but he didn't really know a lot about it. So he only mentions about 3 things, and one of which is a picture of an alien. The other is a picture of this memory metal. A piece of this memory metal, which apparently had. A lot of other people have talked about that as well, and I mentioned a little bit on that. However, the one little gem I did find, which made the whole going through the 179 pages the worth reading for me, was something I'd never read before, and it wasn't in the Day After Roswell book. He said that, and he talks about a list of actions that the Army should undertake, in the coming months or years from when he wrote this. He said they should bomb Phobos, the moon of Mars. They should go and attack it. They should either bomb it or attack it. And that just came right out of the blue. Right out of the blue. I'd never read that before. I'd never read a reference to that. It's in his own notes. And that's partly why, I'm saying what I said previously, because if you remember in the Secrets in the Solar System book, I make the case, and I'm obviously not the first, I'm just repeating what other people have said, and updated it a little bit based on the 2008 research, that Phobos could be a space station, basically, an old space station. And Corso wrote this probably in the mid-90s, late 80s maybe, So what Corso's suddenly doing, saying they should attack Phobos, and you read this sentence, and I've got the quote in the book, and it's quite emphatic, it's like, he's a soldier, you can tell he's a soldier, that's what really comes out. When you read his words, he speaks like a soldier. That adds to his credibility in my view, the way, you think, I don't really like what he says in that way, but he was in the army for heaven's sake, so how else is he going to say these things? Oh, we should go over and kiss him and give him a big hug. If you see what I mean. You'll see what I mean if you either read his book or read what I've written.
That's right,
So that was quite interesting. And then, of course, we get on to this whole idea of the alien autopsy, which I mentioned a couple of times, because that brings us on to Edgar Fouché in one sense, which is one of the, I've got 2 chapters about Edgar Fouché, who I have no doubt, I can't remember if we've spoken about Ed Fouché in these earlier interviews we've done.
Briefly, but
briefly,
in detail,
Yeah, so Ed Fouché, he, to me, is the exception to the rule of those that know don't talk, and those that talk don't know. Edgar Fouché breaks that rule. He does know and he does talk, in my conclusion, from everything that I've seen and read, and I give examples in the book of why I say that. And really it was interesting again how I came into contact with him. As I write in the book, sit back sometimes and think, how the hell did I get? How the hell did I get to this point? How the hell would?
You interviewed him, didn't you?
Yeah, I did for 6 hours, and he used to call me up and he'd chat. And sometimes it was like quite early in the morning because he would stay up late at night because of the the sort of overlapping time zones. It wasn't always easy to speak to him because he would ring about 2 o'clock in the morning, which was about 7:30 for us. Anyway, we used to talk on Uvu quite a bit, and I'd first seen him on this Channel 4 documentary, which is again good year 1999. It was called Riddle of the Skies. That's all available on YouTube.
I've seen that.
That's good, pretty good documentary in the main. A few dodgy bits in it, but generally good. And there's another sequence which I refresh my memory about in another chapter, and that I'll probably mention. But Ed Fouché appeared for about 3 minutes in that, but yet he was interviewed by the team for about 6 hours. He showed them all his documents, proving that he worked in the military, and he's got those documents online. People can go and read them. He has a document which essentially shows that he was on temporary duty at the Nellis Air Force Base, which is basically Area 51, it was north of there. And he tells this account of servicing some equipment, and it said on it, Direct Orbital Code Module, and this is 1979, and he says that there was a voice modulated signal on running through this board that he was testing because there was a fault with it. So that to him suggested they were speaking to somebody up in space in 1979. This was after Apollo, it was after Skylab, it was before the shuttle. So who were they speaking to in orbit in 1979? You know, or why were they sending voice transmissions into space? Okay, they may have been doing some other type of testing where they were bouncing a voice signal from the Earth up to a satellite and back down or something. Possibly it was that. But what he said was he also saw a flying triangle. He saw the flying triangle on 3 occasions. And on 2 occasions he was with other people. The 3rd occasion was the most significant, I think, because it was landed on the tarmac near where he was working, maybe like half a mile away, quarter of a mile away or something, on the runway in Area 51. And he describes it, he describes the colour, he describes seeing the vents on the side, and that there were no discernible engines. And he got other people talking to him about this craft. You know, he learned that it operated on a principle of magnetic field disruption. And what did it use? Guess what? A rotating plasma. 250,000 revolutions per minute, which generated a magnetic field. It was pressurized to 50,000 atmospheres. Why do you pressurize it? To make it more dense. What happens when you make a gas more dense, a metal gas? It increases the number of electrons that can flow through it. Why would you do that? So you can make the magnetic field stronger. And Richard D. Hall, he did a calculation, this was back in 2015, 2014, as part of his tour, which I've shamelessly stolen some information from Richard for that book. This was part of it. And he basically said that if you use this technique of having a rotating plasma, and in fact it's a mercury plasma, mercury is a metal, so it conducts electricity, you compress it, you could make a magnetic field that's something like 2 or 3 million times stronger than anything you could run through a wire. Because what you put through a wire, you have to have a certain current, and a copper wire can only take a certain amount of current because it has an electrical resistance, however small, and the wire will eventually burn out if you put enough current through it, enough electrons into it. But if you have a plasma, the rules are different. So the physics of what Edgar Fouché said, I write about in the book, they check out. They check out. What was the other main thing that I mentioned in the book about Edgar Fouché? Well, in 1998, when he did, to me, what amounted to a big disclosure to the world in 98, this presentation at the UFO Congress in Laughlin, Nevada, 1998, he described in detail how this TR-3B worked, but based on the information that he'd given, he said he'd never worked on it. You know, he knew people that had worked on it, he knew people that had worked on it, and this information had come in a second, third hand and so forth. But he also said that he overheard discussions of something called quasi-crystals.
Oh yes, yeah.
And he said this in 1998. And when I read this, I thought, no, come on, that sounds like Star Trek to me. But sure enough, I looked this up, and it's a field of research, and it's a special type of crystal that's got unusual symmetry, and because of that, it's called a metamaterial, and it has special properties as a material, which makes it very interesting. And I first came across that in 2004 when I was checking out Ed's story, and I came across a PowerPoint or a PDF of all his slides from the talk, by which point he wasn't on the internet, he'd left, discussed at the field of ufology, as he called it. He was quite, critical of the people who just, and he was asked to go and do talks, but he didn't change his story, he didn't embellish his story. He had his story, he put it into a 1.5 hour, 2 hour lecture. That was it. He'd retired, okay, he picked up bits and bobs, but he didn't have any other major disclosures. And then, his house was broken into. This was, I think, in 98, 99, 2000. His hotel room was broken into, and things like that. And then he left the scene, and he didn't come back onto the scene until about 2010, I think it was. That's when I saw him on YouTube, and I posted him a message because he'd hooked up with this Jeremy Riss, who uses this pseudonym of alien scientist. And I knew that Riss was dodgy, already because he wouldn't tell the truth about 9/11, and he would delete comments which corrected his mistakes about Dr. Julian's research. So I'd already crossed swords with this guy on his YouTube channel, so I knew he was dodgy. And it was Ed Fouché that explained to me more about his dodginess. This Jeremy Riss character, alien scientist, was actually caught trying to attack his girlfriend with a machete, and he was sent to prison for attempted GBH, and he was then let out on parole. So people had to pull him off. I don't think this woman was harmed, unfortunately, but he was going to attack her with a machete. Is that a balanced person, do you think? And there's a police report of him being rearrested because he broke the terms of his parole. You can find that report. I've got an archive of that report. I think I reproduced that in one page of the book. And Ed was hooked up with this guy because he was trying to help him. He was trying to help get this guy straightened out because Ed was, to me, he was a good person. He really was very good at what he did, and he got to know what he did because he was very good at his job. He was very good at managing people. He was very good at getting the best out of them. He knew who to pick to get jobs done, what their expertise was, who he could work with, how he could get best out of them. And he actually gave presidential briefings, apparently, when he was working in the military. So he got pretty high up there. His rank was a master sergeant, but he was a fixer. He got things done apparently, and that's what he told me. And I have no reason to doubt, based on what he showed me. He showed he'd been awarded all these honours and awards, and in fact, people didn't believe him. There's one guy that I write about in the book called David Hilton. He didn't believe him, so he submitted an FOIA request for Edgar Fouché's military records. What comes back? Piece of paper with all Ed Fouché's awards written on it, from the FOIA. Exactly the same as Ed Fouché had told, exactly the same. So he was telling the truth. He's not one of these fly-by-night people who doesn't have any evidence, like Corey Good, who I mentioned in the book, or Andrew Basiago, who basically just go on about what a good speaker they are, and this, alleged trip to Mars and meeting Barack Obama, which I, spend too much time in the book on, even though I only spend about 3 sentences on it. That's the problem with this. You get these stories of a secret space program mixed and muddled in with the more, accurate information from people like Ed Fouché, which is why
it does back up what he says.
Backs up what he says. And he talks about the flying triangle, and I mentioned the study of that, about the NIDS study, which was done in 2004, which was done by Robert Bigelow's group, as I say, NIDS. And then just after that study was published, NIDS was shut down. And a little bit after that, Bigelow starts up Bigelow Aerospace. Not a coincidence? And then he sells stuff to NASA. He sells this inflatable module to NASA as part of the International Space Station and stuff. It's all very clever and very good, but, I mentioned that. So Ed Fouché was telling the truth. He talked about anti-gravity technology. I digressed from the alien autopsy, because Corso mentions that, so does Edgar Fouché. In fact, he was given a document by one of his associates which was labelled Attachment D, the alien autopsy, and that had been previously referred to separately, to my understanding, by Stanton Friedman and Jamie Shandera and Bill Moore in their investigation into the MJ12 documents. They picked up some documents which referred to this Attachment D as being an alien, but apparently they didn't have that document. Edgar Fouché was given a retyped copy of it, as it was called Attachment D. So that dovetailed with what Shandera and et al. Had been given either about the same time or a few years earlier. So again, that backed up his story that his sources were genuine. There is a group in the military, run by the military, called MJ12 or something similar, which has the knowledge about the back engineer stuff, has the knowledge of advanced physics, and so forth. And again, you get snippets of information coming out about that, because I mentioned the stories of Ben Rich, where there was this, and it's pretty well known on the internet, this story. Other people have written up again, but we're talking 25 years ago now, 1993, where Ben Rich gave this lecture. He's showing about his research at Skunk Works. He was involved in various aerospace designs and stuff. And he ends the lecture saying, we now have the technology to take ET home. And he shows this disc flying off into space. And that's the end of his lecture.
Yeah.
So, of course, people are coming up to him saying, what are you on about? What are you on about? What are you saying? What are you saying? What do you mean by this? And he talks about them having to work out the solution to certain mathematical problems, but basically they can do this now.
Yeah.
They have this technology. Yeah. And then he walks out, and this Jan Harzan, who became one of the MUFON directors, follows him out to the car park and says, he says, so what, how does this technology work? What's it all about? And the story goes from Jan Harzan that Ben Rich says to him, so how do you think ESP works? And Jan Harzan replies, well, isn't it something to do with all points in space and time being connected? And that's how you can have ESP. And Ben Rich says, that's how it works. And then walks off. So, again, and I make the point in the book that ties right back to what I read in 2004 or 2003 when I learned about Wilbert Smith.
Yeah.
And what he says in the 1950 memo, that UFO research was classified top secret by the US government, and they were investigating on a number of lines, and it's classified 2 points higher than the H-bomb. And one of the research lines they were looking at was mental phenomena. And Smith wrote that in 1950 in relation to the craft being controlled in relation to some type of mental phenomena, which again ties in directly to what Ben Rich said to me, to my way of looking at it, 43 years later. And now we're in, 63 years from when Smith said it. 68 years, sorry. Yeah.
So it just shows how long this has been.
Yeah, so it indicates how long the cover-up has been covered up.
I mean, the
cover-up has been running rather than...
There's going back the Nazis as well, the bell.
Yeah, that's one thing I kind of skipped over.
Because that was really interesting as well when I reading that.
Right, absolutely. So we can mention a bit about that, because I kind of skipped over that, because there is this tie-in with the Apollo program and the Nazi rocket science, which is fairly well known.
Yes.
The paperclip conspiracy, as it was called, was revealed in the 1980s. They did a BBC Horizon documentary about it. Werner von Braun, he was sent over, and I've got a quote in the book from another documentary, I think was by, I forget the name of the chap that did it, but he was given money by the state of, one of the US states. He was given money to investigate the Moonhouse claims, and he went to see this guy who was head of an office in the government which was responsible for pursuing Nazi war criminals. Yeah. And he states on camera that von Braun, if he'd still been alive, would have been investigated and probably prosecuted for Nazi war crimes, because they had documents to show that he approved, the use of torture and slave labour in circumstances which, were not appropriate. Not that there are any appropriate circumstances, but you know what I mean. And he says that on camera. So von Braun was a rocket scientist and also a Nazi war criminal.
Yeah.
So do you think there's some possibility, if somebody at NASA says, well, actually, Werner, we're going to fake this, so just go along with it. When you said, oh yeah, no problem. He's not going to worry about running some fakery when he's been, without any qualms, sending people to, be tortured to death or worked until they die. These people are evil. And he was one of them. He might have had a nice face on it, and he's one of these people that there's some videos of him. I mentioned one that I discovered fairly recently, which was produced by Disney in I think '57, and they show this simulation of going to the moon after von Braun has shown this sort of somewhat ridiculous looking rocket in the intro, which I've got a picture in the book. And so he was put forward in the public's mind as an expert and
nice guy. Yeah.
Nice guy, you know, helping the Americans get to the moon. You know, good on you, mate. You know.
The Nazi thing.
Oh yeah.
Just push that to the side.
Yeah.
That was, you know.
Yeah.
It was. I had to do that because I was forced to do it by Hitler. You know.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do make the point that maybe he would have if he hadn't cooperated, he would have been shot. Maybe that's true. We can't really say that's sure, but even so, you know, what are you going to do? You know, he could have, you know, gone along with it and then, you know, just been a bit more shrewd about what he did. He could have kept alive and kept more of his morals alive than he did. So yeah, and then we got into this Nazi Bell thing, which apparently this was one of the secret black programs in Nazi Germany, which Nick Cook wrote about. And this Igor Witkowski, who's the Polish researcher who'd gone to the Mittelwerk, and he found this, what looked like a solid structure, which he thought might be some type of rig for attaching some type of flying disc to, so it didn't fly off. And this was covered in a 2005 documentary that Nick Cook also would like as a follow-up to the 1999 one. And it looked at this structure called the fly trap, and made the case that it might be something to do with anti-gravity research. And I kind of thought, yeah, maybe it was. But when I read this and I looked at what Nick Cook had written, yeah, maybe it was something. But then, and Nick Cook, having reread parts of his book, or most of his book, I realised that Cook himself had pointed out that this might have been part of a reactor experiment, not necessarily an anti-gravity experiment. You might make the case that they had their own reactor because they needed a lot of energy, you know, to produce high voltage electricity. And then they were using the power from this reactor to do an anti-gravity experiment, maybe. But it appears from the other things, like people that were working on this project, one of them was an expert in nuclear fusion and doing experiments in nuclear fusion. And Igor Witkowski even mentions that, I think, as being, you know, this name, the name of the German scientist whose name escapes me, but it's in the book. He was well known that he was working on early nuclear fusion experiments back in the sort of late 30s, early 40s. You know, because this had already been looked at as a possibility under the Bohr's atomic theory and so forth. And it turned out that this guy actually went to Argentina in the 50s to help them build a nuclear reactor, which was a failed project. I think Cook mentions that in his book. But then he talks about the Bell, which was meant to be this anti-gravity experiment. And then I found out that through Tim Ventura's website, that there'd been a reproduction of this Bell built by this guy called Alan Firminger, who'd spent $1.3 million on it as part of his business interests. And he formed this company called, with somebody else called SAAC. And it was, I think, something like that. I forget the exact, and it's something like Science Applications for America Corporation or something. And it was very, very close to Science Applications International Corporation. The initials were only one or two different. Hang on, that's a bit too weird. So anyway, so that, if you look at that mock-up they did, it doesn't look like an anti-gravity experiment because it's got all these cables running into it. They built a reproduction of it. Not much information about this. Apparently they spent 1.3 million on it. But it looks much more like a reactor, what they apparently built. There's not many details given as to where they got the plans from or what the components were. It doesn't look like a thing that would have lifted off and flown into space, you know, and I make that comment in the book. So I think this Nazi Bell was probably a secret experiment, but I don't think, having reviewed the evidence more carefully with bits and bobs that have become available since Nick Cook wrote his book, I think it was probably more likely to be an experimental type of reactor. Maybe as part of a German nuclear program, which some say they'd already got a nuclear fissionable material made and they were going to detonate a nuclear bomb. I think this might even be a claim that they actually did detonate a bomb somewhere. I can't remember the details of that. Not something I cover in there because it's not as interesting to me. So I cover that about the bell and other bits and bobs related to that.
Hello! And thank you very much for watching the video. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, and I hope you did, please give it a little like. And of course, subscribe to our channel.
We also have our Facebook account, the information is below. And ways you can fund us is also down below. And remember, let's unite and not to fight.
And together, we can unite this planet better. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.